All right, guys. I've been waiting to tell you guys a story about a few videos back. I mentioned that I had a Bigfoot story, and I actually just sat here for 20 minutes in these horrendous mosquitoes, read this report, and then realized that the camera wasn't pointing in the right direction. It actually had dropped down, and anyway, we'll try this again. Okay, so I want to preface this by saying that this happened when I was 18, so 1994, and I was at a friend's camp up in Temagami. We were moose hunting, and back in that day, Sasquatch wasn't a thing. Bigfoot wasn't a thing. We didn't know what it was. It just wasn't an accepted creature. It wasn't real. We never talked about it. Nobody talked about it. It didn't exist. There was a show back in the day called The $6 Million Man, and it was about this guy that had been implanted with the bionic stuff, and he was really strong. And in one episode, I remember he fought Bigfoot, but my brother and I didn't really know what it was. It was just cool. He fought this monster in the forest kind of thing. So that was, one of the only things that we had attributed, like a weird creature, So for us, it wasn't a thing. So when this incident happened, and for many years after, I didn't associate this with Bigfoot. I tried to find out what animal this was, what it could have been. I listened to tons and tons of sounds online. I never associated it with Bigfoot until about 2010. One night I turned on the TV and the show Finding Bigfoot was on, and I was instantly, these people's stories sounded exactly like mine. What they had heard, what they had seen, it was just, every little thing kind of lined up with stories that I had heard from Brian, who is the owner of the camp that I was at, things that had happened to him. It all kind of lined up. So anyway, I'll read this report. Rabbit Lake, Temagami Sound Report. Screams heard by campers while inside a cottage. Witness report submitted July 18th, 2010. Type of report, sound. Date of incident, October 1994. Season was fall, time of day was 10 o'clock p.m. Weather conditions were clear fall evening. However, there was a real strong windstorm that night. My friend Doug and his uncle had gone up the mountain, probably a mile away, and they camped out, and Brian and I were at the main camp. Duration of incident was 2 minutes. Rabbit Lake at Brian's camp cottage. Lone cottage setting, thick bush with swamp and creek on a lake. Nearest town is Temagami, nearest road, Rabbit Lake Road or Highway 11. I was 18 and moose hunting with a friend and his uncle and his dad. My friend and his uncle were camped up in the bush in a tent. My buddy's dad and I were staying at the actual camp on the lake. We had been moose hunting in this area for about a week. This one night we ate dinner, played cards, and after 9 we hit the bunks. Brian was asleep across the room, gentle snoring, and I was just starting to fall asleep. Suddenly this horrendous scream came from outside the camp. I remember describing it like a woman being stabbed to death. It started as a scream but ended as a flat-pitched howl. There was one scream first that made me instantly sit bolt upright in bed. I called for Brian. He continued to snore. Within 30 seconds to a minute, the scream started again, turned into a wail, and ended up as a howl. This thing was moving as it made the noise and went from left of the campsite to the right. I actually got up and woke Brian physically. He had heard nothing. I did not sleep until hours later. The next day, Brian was chuckled and proceeded to tell me that whatever I had heard was nothing compared to what he and his hunting crew had heard years earlier. He then went on to describe the same sounds I had listened to the night before. Brian is a very experienced trapper and hunter and cannot explain what they heard that night. I am now 34 and have been a hunter outdoorsman for 30 plus years. I have never heard anything like this before or since. It has always lingered in my mind. So this was investigated by Roland Fuller. And this is Roland's report. I met with Gary this morning over coffee. It was a very good interview. Just a little background on Gary. He was raised in a rural setting in a town called Redbridge, Ontario. It is located just a few miles northeast of North Bay. Gary is very familiar with the Northern Ontario bush. He has a university degree in environmental studies. Gary was very enthusiastic to talk to someone who would believe him about the noises he had heard. He had encouraged numerous disbelievers and negative responses, so he has become somewhat unoptimistic about anyone getting back to him. Once he relaxed with me, he began to talk so much I had to slow him down to write the info he was giving. Really? Does that sound like me, guys? I don't know. Talk too much? Gary was hunting from the camp on Rabbit Lake that is owned by Brian. There's nothing between the camp and the Ottawa River but wilderness. This is a secluded location and not used very often. Brian had purchased the spot years ago from a native person. Brian and Gary had just settled in for the night to sleep, and Brian was already sleeping, snoring. Gary was just drowsing when the first scream happened. This immediately brought Gary to a wide-awake mode, and he tried to awaken Brian unsuccessfully. The second scream then occurred. Gary physically woke up, and Brian had not heard either scream. The first scream had come from the front side of the camp, and the second from the front north side of the camp. So either there were two individuals or one individual that moved. Brian and Gary stayed awake for a while, and Brian tried to calm Gary and then went back to sleep. Gary took a long time to get to sleep. The next day, they looked around outside, but they never really looked for tracks or other signs other than what they were hunting for. There were two other people in the hunt group, but they had stayed in tent further up the trail and had heard nothing. Gary tried to explain the sounds to Brian, who at first claimed it was a screech owl. Later, Brian said that it was nothing compared to what had occurred previously over the years. Gary's stories, although secondhand, included sightings of what Brian called the outdoor guy. That's not true. Brian referred to this native person as the man. He always called him the man. There were many incidents where Brian was out hunting or from the boat, and he would see the man, watching him from shore or watching him from across the swamp, always in, just a silhouette of a person. He said sometimes he would be wearing a red coat or a reddish, thought it was a coat. Brian had seen many things, many weird, strange things happened up at the camp. The four of them, Brian's previous hunting party, had gone up above a small creek, 10, 12 feet wide, in the canoe in the morning. When they came back down at night one night, there was a log that was so big that four of them couldn't move this and had been dragged across the narrowest part of the creek. And there were no trees around. It was marshland for, a quarter of a mile on each side of the creek. And they couldn't find any tracks in the grass. How did this thing get here? They couldn't move it hardly. It took them, 20 minutes, the four of them, to get this thing out of the way. They couldn't explain it. Brian had a canoe, an 18-foot canoe. I can't remember the make. He thought it was stolen from the camp. And many years after this actually happened, Brian found the canoe way up past the camp north, up that creek, past the end of the lake, miles north of there, hanging in a giant spruce or pine tree, he said. It was like 40 feet up, tied in this tree, and just the skeletal remains of this canoe was hanging in the tree. Who would do that? That is just weird. Things being thrown at the camp when Brian was there. Brian had also found footprints in the mud. He said they were smaller than a man, like a woman or a child, and he thought, there goes a mosquito. And he thought, who would bring their kids out to the swamp to play, kind of thing, miles away from anywhere? But he always brought it back to the natives, and he thought, well, maybe there was more natives there than he thought, and that's the way Brian looked at it. He tried to rationalize it, and maybe there is some truth to that, but there are some weird, strange things that happened up there. And I spent years looking up online every animal that lives here in Northern Ontario and tried to listen to sounds from everything and anything. I can tell you it wasn't, we don't have cougars, but I listened to cougar sounds, a screaming rabbit, a screaming fox, a screech owl. I can go on, and I have never found anything that sounded remotely like this. I'll go ahead and finish this report. Okay, Gary tried to explain the sounds to Brian, who at first claimed it was a screech owl. Later, Brian said there was nothing compared to what had occurred years earlier. He related that as to the outdoor guy. Tracks of bare, wide feet were found around a swamp. Items thrown at the camp. A big log mysteriously moved, but too big for one or even four men to move. Brian described a feeling of being watched, and Gary had this experience. Gary said that Brian felt that there was a native person, First Nations, that was living in the bush behind their camp somewhere, and he would occasionally see him from a distance or in the trees, but not clearly. Gary left the camp 3 days later. The incident has haunted him ever since, and he would not go back to the camp for 4 years afterwards. After the meeting I had, Gary listened to some of the Michigan Recording Project audio files, and he was happy that he had finally heard the screeching sound again, and he was not crazy. He He identified the first clip from the MRP August 30-31, 2008 river crossing event as being closest to what he had heard. In it, there was a screech or scream first and then whoops. He recognized the loud screeching at the beginning and said it sounded like what he had heard, but the howling portion of the Rabbit Lake screeching went on longer. He also mentioned that the human-like portion was there in the screech on the MRP recordings that he could finally identify again. He said that the sound he had heard was very, very loud. We talked about a site visit which will require a follow-up. After the interview was over, I asked if Gary could arrange to talk with Brian because I really wanted to interview him. Gary was reluctant, but later in the day he called Brian to get permission for me to call him and passed his contact information. I called and talked briefly with Brian. Gary was right about the way Brian sees these happenings. Brian sees these as normal, natural events, and maybe so. Brian said he has heard the screeches and seen human tracks not only at Rabbit Lake, but also at a camp he had in Magnetawan. That's the tracks he's talking about, not the screeching. He said that nothing has happened at the camp in a couple of years, and we are going to get together later in the summer. He also invited me to his camp on Rabbit Lake for a long look, although he says there is nothing to see. I will keep in touch with Brian and get a meeting set up. Conclusions. In summary, I feel Gary's event report to be real and honest. There is much more investigating to do here. I spent time searching adjacent area on the south side of Rabbit Lake. There are several logging areas and bush trails. No people live here. The bush is thick and ideal for any creature to live. There are many swamps and small lakes. There are moose and rabbits, ducks and grouse everywhere. I will be returning to this area in 2013 for more investigating. So the only other thing I'm going to add is the feeling of being watched. Oh my God. When we used to go up to that camp when we were kids, we would go pickerel fishing, and we would always go down the shore from camp 200-300 yards. There was a little creek that came out, which is the creek that we canoe up to hunt up above. And the pickerel would come in there in the evening to feed. So we would stand on shore and throw our lines out and catch nice pickerel as kids. And numerous times we stopped and looked at each other and said, it feels like someone's there. Like Doug, my friend that owned Brian's son, owned the camp, had brothers, and a couple times they were up there with us and we thought they were playing tricks on us, but it wasn't them. They were in the camp with Brian, and we were down the shore by ourselves, but we would have swore, you know, we even yelled, called out, who's there? It just, that strong sense, hair standing up on the back of your neck. It's a spooky place. And I didn't go back for many years later, and as an adult, it's still a freaky place to be alone. I don't like to go up there in the bush alone, and I'll go anywhere in the bush except there. One last thing to tell you guys about. Just a few years ago at the camp, we had a boys' weekend. Guys were drinking. My brother and I called it an early evening. We had only had a couple beers each, and we went to bed at about 1 o'clock, and there were 4 guys still up downstairs. I was upstairs in a bunk looking out over the lake. There was a window right in front of where my bunk was, and I seen an orange globe, 10 or 12 inches, slowly drifting across the lake. And I couldn't explain what, it wasn't a lantern. It was moving steady. It wasn't blowing in the wind. It was very steady, moving at a steady pace, 200 feet off the water kind of thing. Very, very orange. And I told my brother, and didn't think too much of it. And about 15 minutes later, I just happened to roll over and be looking out the window again. I saw another one. This time my brother and I got up, ran downstairs, ran out to the dock, and we actually got to the dock in time that he saw it too. We couldn't hear anything, but 2 orange glowing orbs. And if you look up orange glowing orbs on YouTube, there are lots of videos that have exactly what we saw on there. Just another strange incident up there. I don't know what those things are, but they're there. So if you guys have any similar incident, anything, I read everything about Bigfoot now. So I'm trying to determine, is this a real animal? Could it be a possibility? I don't know. Did I have a Bigfoot experience? I don't know. It was a cool, scary story, and it really happened. Thanks for watching.